Hello, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable on the political economy of pleasure, titled Illegal Smile, which is a song by American folk song writer and singer John Prine, who died about a year and a half ago of COVID-19. We'll start this with a quote by Oscar Wilde: "Pleasure is the only thing worth having a theory about." We're going to explore pleasure in many ways in this roundtable. Before we jump into it, let me say a few things. First of all, I'm Greg Scott, your facilitator for today. I want to thank the organizers for inviting this session and for letting us use it and pursue it as a roundtable format. Thank you to the audience for being here, and in advance for engaging actively in conversation with us about the many forms and dimensions and dynamics of pleasure. Mostly, I want to thank these amazing humans who have agreed on very short notice to participate in this roundtable. So thank you, my fellow speakers. Audience, we would like for you to actively participate via chat. If you would put your comments and questions in the chat, we will deal with them in real time as we're having a roundtable, or at the end. The last 20 minutes will be reserved for Q&A. And so if you would please, in the chat, if it's a comment, just say comment and then write the comment. If it's a question, just type the word question and then actually ask the question. That'll make it easier for me as the chat monitor to sort through and find the questions and differentiate them from comments and sidebar conversations. We are very pleased and to have this roundtable, have this opportunity to do this roundtable in this context. From my point of view, the concept and the content and the question of pleasure comes up episodically in harm reduction circles. It's unearthed every now and then for conversation and is a reminder of what we're not talking about most of the time, even though it is a central reason for the use of drugs in the first place. We often jettison the conversation out of political expedience because doing so undermines legitimacy in many realms. It compromises in many ways our abilities individually and collectively to do the work that we are trying to do, to help the people we are trying to help. Yet we return to it, the concept and the idea of pleasure, with occasional events and publications. We seem engaged in a tacit agreement to let it lie in dormancy most of the time. My fellow panelists and I are committed to changing that course and breaking that tacit agreement. And so that's one of the reasons that we have agreed to do this and that we're excited to do this. I can tell you personally that the process of organizing this event has once again lit the pleasure fire in my own belly. Once again, I've made a commitment to taking up pleasure and pursuing it as my primary intellectual and political concern. With this brief intro to the session, I will say we have wonderful speakers, and we're going to each of the folks here has come up with a set of questions that they're thinking about right now, and we're going to turn to each person in order, and they will share the questions with you via chat, and then we're going to reflect on those questions as a group, as a panel, and we invite you to go ahead and submit your questions and comments as we go. So let's get into speaker introductions. We're very briefly each going to introduce ourselves, our name, our organization, but then we're also going to tell you very briefly how we arrived at our interest in pleasure, either pleasure generally or drugged pleasures more specifically. So with that, we'll start with Faye.
Oh, thanks, Greg. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion as well. So I'm Faye Dennis. I'm a Wellcome Trust funded research fellow at Goldsmiths in London, the UK. My research studies drug effects as situated events, which means I'm interested in looking at all the things that go into a drug consumption event and how effects like pleasure get produced, rather than seeing this as something that's inherent to the drug. In terms of how I came into this research area and to studying drug pleasures, I've been trying to think about how to tell this story all day. But basically, I don't think there is just one. And I think there's like multiple stories, and I'm not too sure where to start. So I guess one route in is nearly 15 years ago now as an... as nearly 15 years ago now, as an undergraduate, I wrote an essay on drugged pleasures, and it was a bit of a light bulb moment that I could talk about some of my personal experiences in an academic setting. So then I went on to work in homeless settings and trained as a social worker, but kept coming back to this question of pleasure in the sense of how it was silenced in these settings, even though it was important to the people who use drugs. So then once I'd become disillusioned with social work, which didn't take very long, I decided to propose a PhD project looking at the neglect of pleasure, particularly in regards to drug use that was deemed to be dependent. And from there, I got interested in using different kinds of methods as a way of finding ways to communicate these experiences that were highly stigmatized and hard to communicate. So yeah, that's a bit about how I came to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Faye. Ingrid, let's turn to you. You'll be our second speaker.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Walker. I'm Associate Professor of American Cultural Studies at the University of Washington, Tacoma. And I should say that I'm thrilled about this panel for a lot of reasons, but I'm relatively new to drug studies, really only been doing this for the last 15 years of my career. And I took it up as a mantle because it struck me that there was so much misinformation about drug use in the general sphere, and that there were so many strange and extreme depictions of drug use, but not much information sharing or depiction of what I would consider to be more normative drug use, which is the majority of drug use that's out there. So there's just glaring absence in US cultural studies, in US media, and popular culture. And the more I started thinking about it and got into the field, I learned that actually there's an absence of thinking about why people use drugs and the depiction of other kinds of drug use than substance use disorder in many fields. So I went to write a book about it. And now I'm in a place where I'm actually interested in drug researchers and what influences the way in which we talk about drugs and drug use and whether our lived experience is part of that conversation.
Thanks, Ingrid. Chloe.
I love that, Ingrid, how you say short period of time is 15 years. That's quite a long time, actually, to be working on this. My name's Chloe Sage, and I've been doing harm reduction for about 17 years, and mostly frontline direct service harm reduction. I've also been doing research around drugs and drug checking and some of the results. I started by being an educator, a sexual health and drugs educator in the schools. So we were doing harm reduction education, and then I took over running the Shambhala Music Festival drug checking tent, and I've been doing that, running that program since 2009, but I've been involved in it since 2004. And apart from testing thousands of drugs, and we also have these conversations with people around drugs and drug pleasure. And I started realizing, especially with a lot of help from my team of 70 people, and most are peers, people who use and experience drugs. And I myself am an old raver. So I started out, being one of those kids taking drugs at parties. And I started noticing the difference between our harm reduction messaging and what was really happening. And so I started being like, these aren't making sense. Like, we're not including benefit maximization in our harm reduction messages. So I started really thinking about that and wanting to look really more deeply into that. I also worked out for a long time in needle exchanges and I really like what Faye was talking about. And I'm excited to have this conversation with everybody because I feel like there's a whole population of people that is disallowed to talk about pleasure and their drug use. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me. And let's talk about drugs and pleasure.
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks for being here. Yerlix.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Yarelix Estrada, and I'm located in the Napa Territory, otherwise known as New York City. And I'm a little sick, so sorry for the weird noise that I might make when I'm speaking. And I have been in harm reduction for not that long, for about 6 years now. Started out in peer kind of work and integrated into research and now in larger institutions. And my primary work at the moment is implementing and expanding and operating a drug checking program in New York City. And how I came to pleasure. So I also am a raver. I started going to raves when I was younger and started seeing how fun it was exposed to like pleasure that I had never felt before. That was pleasure that ultimately disrupted my cycles of depression that I had no relief from for a very long time. But also was noticing the unsafety, a lot of like emergencies that would happen in places that were like underground raves and things like that. So I got involved in Dance Safe, which is a peer-run organization that is run by people who use drugs, at helping other people who use drugs in festival settings. And that got me interested in different kinds of substance use. So I started doing opiate research and working with different harm reduction coalitions, helping with expansion of naloxone and syringe distribution and things like that. So for me, it's interesting because I feel like even though harm reduction covers different spaces broadly, from festival settings to places like syringe exchange programs and now larger like governmental interventions for harm reduction, there is more of a focus on pleasure in nightlife and festival settings, but that doesn't often carry over to other spaces. And as someone who works across the spectrum in different harm reduction settings, I think it's interesting that that conversation is not often talked about, and how pleasure needs to be integrated as part of the conversation across all of those spaces. So I'm really excited about this conversation, and I'm really excited to be alongside all these amazing panelists and hearing what we have to say today.
Thanks, Yerlix. And I'm a sociologist at DePaul University in Chicago. I'm approaching my 21st year in harm reduction. Most of that time I spent with the Chicago Recovery Alliance. I came to pleasure. I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday. Like when I was 7, I sneaked a can of beer that my dad had opened and meant to drink, and I drank it myself, and I loved it, and I loved the entire sensory experience of it. And I also like loved the context and the moment and what was happening in that day, the feel of it, the taste of it, the experience of it, and also that my parents like intervened and they were like my trip guides. It was awesome. And then in high school, I had a great social psychology teacher who actually like ran an entire module on how we have assimilated the drug war ideology of policing pleasure into our families and micro interactions. And that was really interesting. Later, I'm in harm reduction, and I was at CRA working on safer injection protocols. And like the job was to figure out new and improved ways to help people figure out small changes in technique that would yield large changes in health consequence, positive changes. And I noticed that like all of the safer injection protocols were fear-based and danger and risk-based. And that pleasure-based messaging just really didn't have, going back to Chloe's point and Yerlich's point, like it just didn't have much of a place in harm reduction. I found that distressing. So that's when it set me on my most recent course within harm reduction to pursue an examination of pleasure in pleasurable ways. So with those introductions, y'all know who we are, a little bit about us anyhow. We're going to turn to the principal content of the roundtable. And so again, we're going to, each of us in turn, offer to each other in the audience the questions that we've been thinking about lately, and we as a group will talk about them, and we invite you as an audience to add in your comments and questions through the chat box. And so we're going to start with Faye. And I know that Maddie is going to be pasting Faye's questions into chat, and that should be happening shortly. But Faye, go ahead and, if you would just talk for a couple minutes about why these questions have become important to you and what's going on with them.
Yeah, sure. And I think it ties into what some of the other panelists were saying as well. And I'm not sure if these are questions or more areas of interest, but yeah, I'll share them. So I'm interested in how we conceptualize pleasure and conceptualizing pleasure in more capacious ways. By this, I mean making space for different kinds of pleasure beyond just like a rational choice that's planned and for fun. I think this can leave out different kinds of pleasure that might be harder to articulate, that's unplanned or maybe even unwanted. So in my research, people talk about not wanting to and wanting to take drugs as something that kind of just happens. So here I'm asking questions about how we can open up our understanding of pleasure in ways that can allow for pleasure in the kinds of drug use where we wouldn't usually expect it to be. So like in injecting drug use, but also more generally in drug use that's deemed to be addictive and dependent. So with this, I think this might allow for discussions and feelings of pleasure to enter spaces where it's currently forbidden. And this ties into my next question of how to open up discussions of pleasure in treatment and harm reduction settings and what might happen as a result. So, for example, one idea that I'm keen to maybe put to the panel is what if we place an emphasis on enabling better experiences rather than reducing harmful ones? And what might that produce? Tied to this, as I've already mentioned, I'm interested in how we study pleasure and the methods we use to expand our understanding of drug pleasures. So I think there's a real need among the research community, but also in research settings, to think more creatively about how we can allow for some of these discussions that are heavily stigmatized. And I know that Greg uses visual methods and film ethnography. So yeah, there, I think that was kind of three kind of general areas that I'm interested in.
And with that, any of us on the panel or on this roundtable can jump in.
I'll jump in because Faye, you just said something that is really, I think, at the center of this whole conversation for me, which is it is strange that harm reduction and drug scholarship has really focused so intensely. I mean, it's not strange, it's historically specific that the focus is on reducing harms, but also coming out of a place of fear. And to me, that sense of emphasizing a better experience really comes from a sense that you can use drugs safely, right? And I think those are the two poles that so much of the discourse spans. And it strikes me that I think you're right. The project really is to share that not only can drugs be used safely, but they are being used safely. They're being used in a variety of ways. And in fact, we don't even know all the kinds of use practices that people have because we're so focused really on an end of that spectrum. So I love the idea of emphasizing better experiences and what would happen if we began to collect that information, from people in the various spaces and communities that we're working with drug users. What would that even look like?
This conversation comes up so frequently and but again, episodically, but I'm thinking about like in 2006, we had a huge fentanyl overdose death spike in Chicago. That's 15 years ago. Now, a report comes out, basically in the last day indicating 100,000 deaths by overdose in the US. And, as drug researchers, we're attracted to and funded to be attracted to deleterious outcomes, adverse outcomes, pathology. And that's like the initial impulse for so many of us in our training is to go after pathology, to sort of a priori conceptualize pathology as the main focus. And I remember some years ago, a bunch of researchers talking about how we've really done a very bad job of trying to understand systematically how people who don't overdose. How people engage in safer use practices and don't end up becoming kind of subject to the gaze of researchers interested in pathology. Same with managed drug use. We know so little about how that actually happens because we don't study it. We study, unmanaged or chaotic drug use.
I think we can't talk about this without talking about the criminalization of drugs, because the reason why we have so many deaths, I live in British Columbia, we have a 39% overdose death rate, which we have changed the language to say drug poisoning rather than overdose. Because the problem is when people are using opioids on a daily basis, every single time that they medicate, they think they possibly could die. So there's a lot of fear associated with taking medication. And I call it taking medication because that's what people are doing when they're using drugs to stop being sick. but there's also pleasure in being alive. And I think in harm reduction, we're so stuck in the PTSD, or actually it's not even post, it's during, of everyone's going to die around us. It's pretty traumatic every day to think, am I going to see them again every time people walk out the door? But if we talk about this in a benefit maximization, maybe we could lift some of that trauma off. Because when I think about drug checking and why we test drugs and why we want to know quantification of fentanyl, number one, we don't want people to die. But two, we also want people to dose correctly so they can get the best out of their drug, right? Because if they're completely out, then they're not going to get the best out of their drug. If they don't do enough, then they're not going to get the best out of their drug. So, I mean, really, if we had legal drugs and we knew exactly how many milligrams of fentanyl was in each sample, then it would be so easy to tell people how to dose. But when we don't know that, we have to really kind of have this line of trying to help people get the best, but also keep them alive. And you know, it's a hard thing to be doing in the concept of a toxic drug crisis, for sure.
Particularly when the principal institution responsible for making it toxic has become our source of credibility and information, as in law enforcement, at least in the public discourse, right?
Yeah, and I think another issue too is the way that research and like our jobs are funded, right? Like if we're given a grant through work to prevent overdoses, and the reason why we're giving that funding is because so many people have died, and the funding tends to be responsive instead of preventative, or trying to be proactive to not to consider things about pleasure and use before a major emergency happens. But then we have to kind of just like play around with like how we do the work. We're like, well, we can squeeze in this thing in this way under the umbrella of whatever it is that we're doing. But that definitely limits our work. And I know in our drug checking program, one of the things that I was really interested in was integrating questions around pleasure and like, positive feelings that someone was having during their experience or has had. But our research team was like, well, there's no reliable way to capture that in the data. And it's so variable that it's not really good information. And I was just like, but how? Like, it's such a strange comment, because people go to drugs for many different reasons, one of which is obviously pleasure. And yes, it's difficult because there's so many subjective experiences that are so vastly different. But at the end of the day, if we have to appease funders and collect only adverse reactions and submit all the adverse reactions, then there's all this data of all the scary things that drugs do, the harmful things that drugs do, but then we don't have this like huge catalog and compiled information that a lot of people who use drugs have experienced personally, but have no place to put it because it hasn't, there isn't that validation, that mechanism of integrating it into current research, which I think is sad. And I hope that there's ways to include that.
Exactly. It just reproduces this image and stigma. And there is like a massive machinery in politics around like keeping the focus on harm. And yeah, I think as researchers, we're probably part of that as well. So it's good to try and question.
Well, I also wonder, like from a social movement building point of view, like we built the harm reduction movement in part by trading away our interest and our passion for pleasure, and instead focusing on risk minimization, damage containment, disease avoidance, and these other kinds of things, right? And that was a big part of how we got legitimized as a movement. So that's an ugly history. It looks like we might be at time for this portion. Thank you, Faye, for those very provocative questions. Much appreciated, and panelists for talking so thoroughly and passionately about Faye's questions. We're going to move to Ingrid now. And so Maddie is going to post Ingrid's questions, the questions that she's been thinking about recently, or perhaps for a very long time, in chat. So Ingrid, if you could take us on our next leg of the journey.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what I've been thinking about dovetails beautifully with what Faye teed up for us. And I want to say that issue, for me in the United States especially, and it's not terribly different in the UK and in British Columbia, but and the other places that people are listening from, because the main export the United States has done really here is the drug war. But I want to think about the ways in which all these conversations that we have are utterly framed by criminalization and medicalization. And I think we undersell the influence of medicalization quite often as we think about individual drug users and pleasure and the kinds of choices that people make. So another way of thinking about this is really that in the US cultural context, at least, which is my field, it's so dominated by those two influences of criminalization and medicalization. Drug pleasures are almost inconceivable unless, of course, you use drugs. So I feel like I'm constantly trafficking these two worlds, which is my communities in which I use and people use, and we share drugs and we know each other, and then these other, sort of more public spaces. But my biggest surprise when I moved to this field from another field was the ways in which harm reduction and drug research communities also struggle to acknowledge pleasure. And we've talked about why just now. And I do think there are many reasons for this. And one of them really is out of care and respect for those people who do struggle with drug use, among other reasons, and the burning need there is to put resources and focus attention there. But there's also just this trepidation around recognizing drug pleasures as if that's antithetical, right, to that other concern. So for me, I'm really interested in the way that self-motivated drug use, whether it's managed or not, is part of well-being, and sort of reframing and thinking about it that way. I think culturally it's seen as antithetical to well-being, so it can be hard to imagine that way. But as Chloe said, this is people taking medication. We are constantly adjusting our experience of the world to all kinds of substances and experiences, and drugs are one of those tools. They've been sort of vilified and held up as this extreme tool, but that's not my experience of most people most of the time as they use drugs. And I know that the data bears that out. So the last thing I'll say is that I think that what's missing is understanding the various reasons and practices of drug use and the outcomes of those experiences, which I think is important not just to research, but to drug policy and especially to medicine and public health. And the question for me is, how can we get there if we struggle within our own communities to speak openly and authentically about our drug pleasures? When we were preparing for this panel, I said something about, I've been doing drugs since I was 13. It's a well-honed practice in my life. It's consistent, and I trust it. And so making it safe, making sure we have a safe supply is really the biggest barrier we have right now to a lot of people being able to enjoy their drugs and not suffer the consequences. But I think the second barrier really is this issue of, can we talk about getting high as a good thing?
Any of our speakers, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that for me, being in harm reduction and being in a career around drugs, drug use has informed my work so much. It was only when I started actually trying new things and experimenting with drugs did I start realizing what harm reduction tools and messaging needed to happen. And before that, I actually didn't realize that. So I don't mean everybody has to do drugs. Like, obviously, everybody doesn't have to do drugs. I feel like that we don't have to be all one side or all the other. I just feel like, for me, it has informed my practice and my work and has made me a better harm reduction worker in the long run for myself.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about conscious drug use, as Sean Kelly termed it in the or called it in the chat box. But thinking about that as a practice of well-being, as a practice not just of self-care, which I think is a problematic construct in so many ways, but as community care. And that's something that now I'm thinking about, Ingrid. So thank you for spurring that thought. I'm not sure where I'm going with that thought, but I really like this idea of assimilating that. And I think it is differential, right? We can't talk about pleasure and drug use without talking about privilege and differential enforcement and differential policing of pleasure, not just by the police, or maybe not even especially by the police, but by institutional actors that we're surrounded by, who are carrying out the dogma of the drug war on a daily basis through these micro interactions and through like penalties for, you know, this, that, and the other thing, because our drug use is somehow displeasurable to them.
I was going to say something about the medicalization point, so I don't know whether, should I just, no, I just like what you were saying about, like, sometimes we pay so much attention to the criminalization stuff and not so much the medicalization, but I think the medicalization has just as, like, there is an issue in terms of, you know, deciding that not going down the moral route, but going down the, these people are sick route. That still has a lot of issues attached to it, which I think, yeah, silences pleasure as well. Sorry, that's probably a bit off topic.
I mean, I don't think so. I think the pathologization occurs in both of those realms. But I'm also, Ingrid, when you're talking, I'm thinking like, wow, like, and Chloe, when we talk about medicating and dosing, you know, with substances that we're getting in a very unstable marketplace, we're also talking about offsetting the deficiencies and the failures of mental health care systems and other healthcare systems, right? We're constantly having to develop new ways to deal with the failure of normative institutions to meet needs that we have.
It's interesting when we talk about medicalization. I was just thinking about how one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time on is trying to destigmatize drug use and change our language around using drugs. And so, you know, there's been a lot of work done to take abuse out of drug use, right? And changing it from drug abuse to drug use, which is a really good thing. But at the same time, what that has done is it's actually now when with the medical models talk about drug use, they're really trying hard not to use the word abuse. So they just blanket all drug use as drug use. And so anybody who uses drugs, they start talking about it as if it's a medical issue, and problematic substance use. Like there isn't, it's like the spectrum of drug use is not brought into play, like that there is actually beneficial use on that spectrum and all the way to problematic use. And you could be in problematic use with one drug, but be in beneficial use with another one. You could be in several different places on this spectrum. But I think one of the things that happens when we try to change language is some things get lost in translation of how we talk about the different kinds of substance use, because now it's just all substance use. And I feel like I'm categorized all the time in the same category as someone who has like a serious problematic substance use. And we all need different things, right? And of course we can all have the right to seek pleasure, but we also need different, absolutely need different things in with our substance use. So I just think it's just interesting how, you know, when we're trying to change things, sometimes things get so generalized and sort of whitewashed, or, you know.
And that might be part of the silencing effect that Ingrid's talking about, like research not feeling that they got much to say about that kind of drug use, you know.
Yeah, and I think something else that's interesting, like I see in the US, is a lot of there's stigma across all different kinds of drug use, but there seems to be less stigma if it's a prescribed medication. And that becomes differential, because if you live in a particular area or are a particular race or are of a particular socioeconomic status, it's a lot more difficult to get prescribed medications. Whereas other folks that are white, wealthy, etc., they might be able to access certain prescribed medications that also exist in the black market. But one community of people may use the black market drug, and the person that has more privilege may access this legal, medical medicine, whatever. Even though there's still overdose risk across the board, there's still similar issues with using these substances across the board. So it ties back to issues with privilege, and also with prohibition, because if all of these things were legal, as opposed to having to squeeze into medical models that are extremely restrictive and only benefit certain populations, then we wouldn't have this issue that we have now with medicalization.
Yeah. In our private chat box, it was keep going, yeah, like
Yeah.
you say it. We have some really great comments and questions coming up in chat. So I'm going to be trying to monitor that more closely and funnel them back in. We are going to move on to our next set of questions, because this is, as Chloe pointed out in our group chat here, it's a great segue into talking about privilege and differential constructs and so on. So that's I know really a big part of Chloe's questioning. So yeah, let's turn it over to Chloe Sage.
Well, actually, I was just nodding to Yerlik's what she was saying, because it really does come back to some of us get the privilege of pleasure and others don't when it comes to drugs. And we have all these spaces created that we pay for to get high in, whether it's alcohol or other drugs. I mean, some people pay thousands of dollars for a ayahuasca weekend retreat with the guise that it's about, self-awareness. I've done ayahuasca. It's pretty pleasurable. So I think there is some pleasure in there as well. And I do think that if we can't afford to be in those clubs or festivals or retreat spaces, and we have to use our drugs in public, then we're really seen as, being sort of a public nuisance or criminalized in some way. And so I think when we talk about pleasure and drugs, we have to make sure that we include all the spaces and all the people in all the different areas that we use drugs, not just focus on sort of the festival or paid environments and I find also when it comes to drug elitism, there's also some groups of people who use drugs stigmatize other groups of people who use drugs. And so that is also a way that we're kind of not accepting that certain drugs can give pleasure. It's, they're only using as a response to trauma. Well, people who have trauma can also use drugs for pleasure. That's entirely possible. And sometimes very positive, and sometimes it's negative. But a lot of the negative factors surrounding drugs and drug use do come from outside factors that are affecting us in our life. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I know we've been really talking about privilege and pleasure through this entire panel. So I feel like it's been a thread through everything. And I know everybody has things to say about it. So.
I guess I can jump in really quick. I feel like, we look at I'm sure the responses in other places have been similar, but in the US, when things start to change, when policies start to change, when the help starts to come for overdoses, for, drug-related mortality or morbidity, it's a certain type of person that has to be affected, that has to die. In the US, it's white, like wealthy white people. And I think that follows with the way that people are accepted for their drug use, right? And so I think something that's interesting that I see happening, like Chloe mentioned, is like the wave of psychedelic decriminalization that's happening in the US, which is great. You know, like I'm the director of the New York City Psychedelic Society. I love psychedelics. I'm passionate about helping others like figure out how to use it as a tool. But even within that community, there are people, namely like wealthy white men, that disclose their use and they come out as leaders in the field, right? But then when there's other people that have different identities that come out about their drug use, then they're still labeled as potentially criminal, or, you know, they must have a substance use problem, or, you know, these kinds of different issues. And even amongst these communities, there are people from, for example, the psychedelic community that practice psychedelic exceptionalism and say like, oh, but the LSD or like mushrooms, this is medicine. That stuff that you are using, that's, you know, that's dangerous. Those are hard drugs and you should go to jail for using that or for selling it. And that's not acknowledging the pleasure across the spectrum that everyone has the right to experience, you know, and experience safely. And unfortunately, across these different communities and spectrums, a lot of folks can't because of prohibition. But that's something that kind of came up for me as you were sharing, Chloe.
And I feel like go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I always have to feel like I need to do a disclaimer or something. Like I'm not by any means trying to minimize, the mental health crises that can be triggered by taking psychedelics if someone has underlying conditions. You know, there's all kinds of like, you know, issues around drugs that can have negative impacts, obviously, but we talk about them all the time. So I just want people to understand that when we're talking about this, it doesn't mean to minimize some of the risks associated as well. And why I have to do that disclaimer is just, you know, it's just part of it, right? Like even just having a whole panel on pleasure, I'm feeling like, oh my God.
So that leads me to want to say this, that I think that this issue of privilege, which is so real and so fraught through there's so many threads to be pulled on here. It connects to something for me that it also connects to the substance itself, right? So I would prefer meth to sort of a pharmaceutical version of a stimulant. And it's really interesting, you know, how I can say that and do say that in public spaces, and the way it's received, whereas other people, you know, could not. I think going to Yarlix's point and to your point, Chloe. But I also think the other place that I think this happens, this privilege shows up, is this notion of recreational drugs versus other, and other again is a giant spectrum of drug use. But this notion that we even just think about drugs as recreational, as opposed to sort of a part of a life, you know, holistic life practice, which I think they are for a lot of people. And by that, I don't mean like I wake and bake every day. I wish I could. I wouldn't get my work done if I did. But I mean, you know, I mean that it's not. I'm not just a weekend warrior all the time, or I don't think of it as recreation all the time when I use drugs. Sometimes I do. Right. And sometimes I don't. And I think our language is such a barrier to even thinking about the multiplicity of pleasures in any kind of drug use. And it's fraught with that issue of privilege that you both brought up.
I think also when we put people in boxes, where as recreational users and as people who are addicted or daily users, we make assumptions about people. And my assumptions have been wrong again and again, because I have made assumptions before they even start talking about what box they fit in as a user, so that I can give them the right kind of information or something. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, totally right. Don't make assumptions. That's what I got out of that.
And use in the context of addiction or substance use disorder can also be recreational, and it can also be pleasurable, right? And this actually makes me think of Faye's work around drug injection, and sort of, I know, Faye, you've spent some time thinking about that intersection of pleasure and substance use disorder or addiction. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
No, just to kind of support what everybody's been saying, and that I think the research that I do, I see people that, you know, I work with people that are put in that box of being addicts, and therefore they can't experience of any of these things. But what I was always seeing was that people were very much engaged with pleasure, and they were very much choosing drugs and choosing the environments they use and the people they use with, the music they listen to, that everything that was going on was kind of to maximize that pleasurable effect. But yeah, when it came to talking about this with drug workers and stuff, it just wasn't something that they could talk about. So there was always this disconnect between what people were saying backstage, what people were saying to me, or like when I was working in homeless settings, when I was at the front desk, and what I was hearing people talking about amongst their peers, versus what happens when you go into the doctor's room or something. It was completely different. And I just think it's problematic making people perform those sort of roles. Yeah, I just think that we need to have more honest conversations about actually what people are using drugs for. And I think everyone's right in saying that there's multiple things going on. It's not just one thing. It's not just because of trauma. It's not just because of pleasure. It's like lots of things going on. So it is about having more complicated conversations.
I want to throw capitalism under the bus here too. Angel Gunn in the chat said the Canadian nation state doesn't want poor people feeling pleasure at all. Criminalization, including the violent crackdown on tent encampments by municipal law enforcement, all of these laws keep business owners and landlords comfy. Defunding and abolishing the police is a mandate for keeping people who use drugs safer long term. And I think that we can't, just like, we can't sort of set aside law enforcement, we can't set aside capitalism in thinking about the shaping of a discourse around pleasure and the enforcement of a discourse around pleasure. And even I think, like Ingrid, when you were saying, like, we've also internalized it so much. Like if I did a wake and bake, which I'd love to do every day, I'd never get anything done. But it's like that never get anything done part, right, is such a big driver, and we're held accountable to getting things done, a certain kind of thing done, and other kinds of things not done, other kinds of pleasure not pursued. So I just wanted to throw out the capitalism piece there too.
I'm also interested in the ways in which people use drugs to facilitate getting things done, whatever those things are. And again, there's that so for me, I can't use cannabis and think very clearly. So that's just me. Some people really have a laser focus on their drug, and it's great for them to be super effective doing certain kinds of things. But I guess this for me is part of this discourse of recreational drugs, or I medicate, versus these are the ways, like, I might get up and do some meditation or some yoga and I have caffeine, and then I might use some meth or some Adderall if I'm going to be writing for the day, right? There are things and practices I have, but they're not always an event in and of themselves. And the pleasure of them can be a facilitation of some other thing that I'm doing, whether it's going to the rave or if it's, doing some work. I sound like I was shilling for capitalism there. Sorry about that.
Well, what I'm hearing from you, Ingrid, is it's deeply personal. And what works for one person doesn't work for another. And with pleasure, it's really our job in life to find out what our pleasure points are for ourselves, and be able to do that in a non-shaming way, right?
Yeah, kind of on that thread, like, I think a lot of people use drugs for survival purposes, or just to make life bearable, in whatever circumstances that might be. Because there is a lot of stigma of folks who use drugs that might be unhoused. But, if they're using for comfort, or if they're using for protection so that they can be vigilant a little longer and not get robbed, or if they're using so that they can work longer hours so that they can make money to, like, pay to stay somewhere that's safer than in the street, and those are valid reasons to use drugs. And in that, it may make life just a little more pleasurable than it would have been had they not had that, and not had that assistance to help them get to a place where they can make it through the night or make it through, you know, whatever task it is that they have to get done that is already way more difficult because of the circumstances in which they're having to carry them out.
Right, which I think you've just constructed a wonderful segue to your own set of questions, and I love that. Thinking about the multiplex of factors we're discussing here, the healing power of pleasure, which is the subject of your first question, Yarlix, is something that we haven't really taken up in this panel yet. So, want to take us down another path?
Sure. Yeah, so like I remember there's a lot of things that came up when I talked to Chloe yesterday that I thought was really helpful in preparing for this, but just the acknowledgement that pleasure is good and it's really vital for having a good life, right? Like I think about all of us are engaged in some sort of social justice work or like work in the community that's really hard. Like doing this work is not easy. It's very, very tiring and it's very easy to work out. And by having pleasure, you know, that kind of renews us to be able to feel good again and to be able to continue doing this really difficult work in the context of this like really crazy time of like, you know, post capitalism and COVID and like all the other things that are just oppressing down on us every day. And so drug use is one pathway to that pleasure. It's one pathway to relax, to relieve, to feel good again. And something that is sad is that oftentimes pleasure is highlighted as being destructive. Like, oh, if you use drugs and you experience too much pleasure, then you're just going to destroy your life and you're never going to come back. Where like in reality, yes, that is a reality that could be true for a lot of folks, but there's also the same truth that can also coexist, that people can use drugs for pleasure and can experience different forms of pleasure, and it can be something that is healing. It could be something that benefits the self, that allows for growth, that allows for someone to keep going in whatever it is that they're doing. And so that's something that I think is really beautiful about a lot of harm reductionists that I've met, that like we use drugs because it feels good and it keeps us going, you know, because if not, we would have quit a long time ago because this shit is hard. And I think that I'm lucky that I've had the opportunity to organize with groups and organizations that are represented by people who use drugs, like people who use drugs that are actively using, that are actively organizing for things that they care about now, and also like trying to propose research studies in things that they know are needed, because you know we're the only ones that know that those things are important. Because if you don't use drugs, sometimes it's hard to know what impacts a person from day to day. And so I think the healing aspect is really important, but something that I'm also interested in discussing and just like trying to understand in terms of the institutions that we're working in. Like Greg, you mentioned that in part, the part about us being able to be validated is having to give up these parts of ourselves as harm reductionists, as drug users, so that we can be, you know, validated by institutions. But like, what is harm reduction without drug users, right? Like, why is it that why is it that the thing that's being studied or the thing that's being served or like the community that's this is supposed to be for is now being shut out because it's like, oh, like drug use is cool, but also don't be in this, you know, government space or in this research institution and tell us that you use drugs, because that's, you know, that is not what you should be talking about here. We're professionals. So I just think this discourse about, you know, what is it that we're doing in harm reduction and how is it that we can bring these aspects back? Because we have so many barriers, right? Like the institution puts up all of these barriers. But I'm interested in like figuring out how we can counter and change that discourse so that we could start prioritizing pleasure, including pleasure, centering people who use drugs in positions of leadership within harm reduction, and doing that in a way that doesn't lead to us getting fired or like losing like our privileges that we have as people.
Someone in chat, someone talked about conscious use of drugs for pleasure being a protective factor, which is an interesting thought to have. But it also, at the same time, kind of puts us back in that position of saying, okay, actually, if we were to, you know, really make a concerted effort to rethink the framing of drug use and rethink, you know, the benefits and prospects of ritualized use and sort of conscious use and use for pleasure as a protective factor against, say, overdose, we're kind of doing the same thing. We're kind of perpetuating that same ideology of risk and danger and threat, and playing to the powers that be that want us to be doing quarantine and containment and, relegating disease to over here and keeping, the rest of society safe from those of us who are using. So I don't know what I think about that, but I'm totally intrigued by the questions that you're asking.
There's such a cycle to this too, because NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, provides most of the funding for drug research in the United States and beyond, like 80%. And so if the National Institute of Drug Abuse, right, is framing research projects, sort of there's one level of thinking about and discourse about drug use. But then there's this self-policing that goes on in academia around identifying as a drug user or not, and that issue of credibility. I'm working on a survey of drug researchers right now, so it's not just academia, it's people in all different kinds of research positions. But the number one concern is whether or not they will be seen as credible, which is ironic because it seems to me to be more credible if you were a drug user, you'd have some knowledge about what you're creating research about. But of course, there's that factor that Jarlix was talking about of, we need to be affirmed by these external institutions. And I think to a certain extent, the same thing happens within harm reduction. I don't work within harm reduction, but I see it as I hang out with and research with people in harm reduction, that there's also there's just this fine line everybody's walking about whether or not do I identify as a drug user. Can I talk about experience with drug use or the knowledge I have in a way that doesn't have to out me as a drug user? And it's like, there's all this knowledge that we're not benefiting from because we can't even have that conversation.
There's also a hierarchy within harm reduction. When you're a peer, you get paid like half the amount as someone who is not a peer. And what if we're all peers? So, we really have to look at equal pay for people who come out as people who use drugs. Like in harm reduction, it's really unfair the way that hierarchy has continued. It's folks who are within communities of people who use opioids that are doing the most life-saving responses. Some people say, yeah, I've naloxoned 60 people. It's like, what person in healthcare can say they have done 60, maybe a paramedic, but these are paramedics getting paid, minimum wage because they're people who use drugs. So I do think we really need to make it a more equitable pay scale when it comes to within harm reduction and people who come out as people who use drugs. Maybe more people would come out as people who use drugs if there was a more equitable space.
Yeah, while I was involved with Chicago Recovery Alliance, I once proposed not equality, but equity. And the standard of equity would suggest that we pay more for the expertise that is embodied in drug use. And it didn't go over well. The idea did not go over well. And so, this is a problem in harm reduction, right? The sort of alternating between fetishizing drug use and, decompensating or discompensating it. And I just really sometimes get very, very concerned about our own movement and the institutions that we've built up within the movement. Again, I'm feeling like I sound like a broken record, but I do believe that we are reproducing a lot of these core ideologies of control and surveillance and, efficiency and so forth in the protocols and the procedures that we use for hiring and seeking funding and using funding to carry out projects in certain ways. I don't want to say it's all bad, but I think we have a culpability there.
Yeah, I think here there's a big, just picking up what Chloe was saying, there's a big issue with relying on volunteers and peer mentors as unpaid positions. So yeah, that's definitely something that should be addressed.
Yeah, and Alyssa Stryker in the chat just said Chloe brought up the role of peers in harm reduction, peers job title versus peers people who use drugs, and what that distinction means in the field. She would love to hear the panel talk more about the discourse around peers and peer support and how it relates to some of the divisions between drug users that we're talking about here today. I don't know if anybody on the panel has thoughts on that.
I think one of the things that happens, first of all, I don't like the term peer, and I think it should be person with lived expertise, because they're experts in the field, and experts, yeah, should be treated as such, as experts, be consulted with, not tokenized, and brought into the spheres of not just work, but decision-making processes as well. One thing that I'm really noticing, and because our death rates are so high and because of COVID and services being cut, the workload and the burnout rates are so high with direct service harm reduction work. And I'm sure it's the same all over North America. I doubt BC is unique in that. But a lot of that falls to the people with lived expertise who are hired as peer workers to do support in their own communities, but they don't have the clinical supervision or counseling access, support access, any of those things that are afforded to healthcare workers are not afforded to these groups of people who are out there in the streets every single day. And may not have like the input that I get from people is, I don't have a counseling degree, and yet someone is just telling me their entire life of trauma. I don't know what to do, right? Like, and they need support with this, but there's just no funding for that kind of support. And I did hear about one program that tied a clinical supervisor, meaning a counselor, to the program and said we would not connect, we wouldn't have this program happen unless they had access to the support. And I just thought that was just a really amazing model to follow, is to have that support built in for folks, because yeah, what happens in that is people's use goes way up because they're trying to cope with these, and there's no support around that. And so we're losing people, right? And people are using after not using for a while, and so they're way more at risk of dying. So yeah, we really need to revamp and overhaul our peers with lived experience, our expertise programs for sure.
All right, yeah, thank you for that, Chloe. Sorry, I was slightly distracted by copying and pasting comments and questions from chat into another document so that we can have a facilitated discussion at the end. And just so y'all know in the audience, we have just a few more minutes left on a couple of more questions, and then we're going to do a Q&A for about 20 minutes or so, 15 or 20 minutes. So please continue to put your questions and comments in chat. All right, so I guess we're going to now turn to some of the questions that I've been thinking about. And I'd like to cut my time a little bit here. So we'll just do maybe 7 minutes or 6 minutes or so we have a nice 20 at the end. And my questions are coming up. So I've been thinking, obviously, so I've got a couple of questions. One is just thinking about, as I've said before, the way that we built and shaped the harm reduction movement, particularly in the US, and its original framing as being one of, being born of political expedience. I think of, Edith Springer's, Bridge to Treatment, and like one of the ways we were able to get some funding, get some legitimacy to do the very necessary work of harm reduction was to engage in that political discourse where we acknowledge that it's dangerous and it's risky and it contributes to disease, morbidity, and mortality. And we're going to help the common good by containing that disease, which in my mind has always been a foray into one kind of quarantine. And so, we out of that have developed as a harm reduction movement now set of institutions, or what I would call a social service sector in the US, what I think is a pretty conservative approach to doing the work, at least discursively. And by that, I mean that we don't talk about these things very much. We certainly don't talk about pleasure really at all, in my experience, with funders or potential funders. So I've thought about that a lot, and I've also thought about some of the other not so pretty internal dynamics of harm reduction writ large. And I think this kind of complicated relationship we have with pleasure shows up in really interesting and troubling ways. And I think about fentanyl in particular. And like I said, our first experience with fentanyl in Chicago was in 2005, 2006. And the discourse then hasn't really changed. It hasn't really changed much since then, in that a lot of us refer to it as poison, and it's contaminated and it's adulterated the heroin supply, as though heroin is somehow better than fentanyl. When in fact, a lot of people really love fentanyl. A lot of people prefer fentanyl to heroin, as I do. And there are many of us who are fentophiles, like we really enjoy it, but it's sort of really getting a lot of bad flack in the harm reduction community. And I'm always perplexed by those kinds of things when they happen. But I guess stepping away from harm reduction, the other set of questions that I think about have to do with the way that drug war ideology has infiltrated micro interactions in families and schools, and the way that drug war ideology intentionally creates silence. So, right, I mean, discourse is about what we can and do say, but it's also about the silences and what we don't say and what we're penalized for saying. So yeah, those are some of the questions that I've been thinking about lately. Oh, and the drug user organizing one, thinking about drug user liberation and drug user union organizing in the US, one of the last things that you can afford to do if you're trying to get a seat at the table, which all these state like governmental entities love to have a seat at the table for somebody with lived experience, is to talk about drug use for pleasure. It's a politically very, very risky thing to do. You will potentially lose your seat at the table. And also fuck the table.
Yeah, just start a different table, right? Yeah. New table.
As I'm listening to you, Greg, and I really appreciate everything you just said, I kind of cycling back through some of the things that we've said, and your Alexa's point about pleasure is healing. And I'm thinking about pleasure as a human right. And I think Chloe, we've all been sort of talking about the different ways in which the privilege mitigates against us even imagining that, right? But pleasure is a human right. And I think that in this moment in time where we are in a crisis of people dying from dangerous drug use, not of their own fault, at a time when people are dying of COVID, a time we're isolated from each other, that notion of mental health, which is why so many people use drugs, right? We're managing our consciousness and our mood. There are many different ways of thinking about your mental health, and there's I always think of like there's getting to baseline for me, and then there's sometimes above baseline, right? And I'm sort of on either side of that line frequently, and I think this notion of pleasure as a human right is something that really might be the next prong approach as we try to move away from these discourses that are silencing ourselves. That damn table, let's just get up and leave the damn table. And I think in this time where people feel really afraid and isolated and worried about themselves, their mental health and their physical health, that this might be the place where that discourse takes root a little more broadly. And there are a lot of problems with that. I think the ways in which people have been able to or not able to access the drugs that they choose to use during this time is challenged because of everything going on with COVID. But I'm just feeling hopeful for a second.
Yeah, I've heard people starting to talk about pleasure as a human right, and I think you're right that it's potentially interesting route to go down that might help us out. And there's a couple of researchers, Charlotte Walsh and Melissa Bone in the UK, that talk about drug pleasures and pleasure as a human right.
I think that one of the examples of where we've changed the discourse on pleasure is sex, because for a long time when we were doing harm reduction with sex, it was like, you just don't want to get pregnant, or you don't want to get HIV, or STIs are bad, so you may as well, you want to use protection. But talking about sex and pleasure was actually a pretty taboo subject when it came to safety. And I feel like that discourse has really changed. And people are talking about pleasure and sex. So I think we can take a page from that book and kind of follow the way that has gone. I also just wanted to bring up the concepts around drugged pleasures while having sex. So a lot of us like to take drugs and have sex. And some drugs really lend themselves to a good sexual experience, and others not so much. But I think one of the discourses that hasn't changed and needs to is around consent and drugged pleasures and sex, because we still kind of talk about sort of, well, you can't legally give consent when you're high. And so there isn't a lot of harm reduction sort of put out there around, what do we do if we're high and we're having sex and we want to do that? Then what are some things we can do to still have a safe experience, but have a very pleasurable sexual experience? So I feel like those discourses kind of need to come together in order to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a common theme in our panel. Now we're transitioning, if everyone's okay with that, to a more open discussion with each other and with the audience. But like a common theme in this panel today has been that gradient, right? And trying to really tackle these and undermine, challenge, diffuse the power of these dualisms and binaries presented as opposing poles. And I think that is very difficult terrain for us to work in. And I think when we have a hard enough time with drugged pleasures and sex pleasure independently as discourses, and bringing them together, particularly in a besieged community like harm reduction. I would consider it to be relatively besieged community, becomes an extra big challenge. And one we should absolutely not turn away from. We have starting with a recent question that's kind of on point here from Catherine. She's saying she's been doing rights-based research on plant medicine in the context of the right to culture, social and cultural rights in the global South. And she's thinking that pleasure is intrinsically, culture is intrinsically related to pleasure. That is a super interesting comment, and also to human rights. And wondering what our panel's thoughts are on drug policy and the intersection between the right to culture and pleasure. I wonder if any of us have thoughts on that. Oh, there it is.
I guess I can start. I think what comes to mind for me is how, and I don't know if this extends to other countries, but the genesis of drug policy is criminalization, right? And so like indigenous people had their plant medicines and their cultural practices way before drug policy existed. But as drug policies started to be made in the US, they came from a place of wanting to criminalize and surveil indigenous communities, communities of color, immigrants. And then those things that were once legal, fundamental to people's cultures and fundamental to their rituals and practices, became illegal. And And, that's happened over time too, where it's like, oh, this community of people uses this drug, let's make that illegal too. Oh, this community of people uses this drug, let's make that illegal too. And so in the context of drug policy as we currently have it, and as it stands, it stands as a way to criminalize particular groups of people. And it's, as it intersects with culture and pleasure, I don't know. I think that like drug policy is just like fucked, and it's really strange as we're trying to move out of that, how the cherry picking happens and how the the justification for why certain drugs shouldn't be criminalized yet leaving others should be. Uh, and this is like somewhat related, not completely related, but something that we talked about a bit yesterday as well about, we tend to sometimes be so hyper focused on drugs and decriminalization or legalization within the context of our countries that we often don't take the time to think about the supply chain issues that we're getting these drugs from, right? So like we think about cocaine and the amount of suffering that's tied to indigenous communities that have to grow the coca and have to be brutalized in some situations by those that are trafficking the drugs into our countries. And while it is extremely important to decriminalize, legalize, to make this something that's available for people who use drugs so that we don't lead to, increases in morbidity and mortality, we also have to think about like, what is the discourse around the global South? What is the discourse in indigenous communities, and what work we need to do there? We can't be just focused on, okay, we're just going to decriminalize, but that suffering is still happening. And there could be models of like fair trade drugs, fair trade cocaine, fair trade, etc. But then the conversation would have to be global, and we would have to be coordinating a lot more than we are now. And I know that there's a different panel about like the hyper focus of drug policy in the U.S. and that's something that we have to work through, because it's also interesting to me how there's this interest in plant medicines and cultures and indigenous cultures. And why is it happening? Because people are starting to use ayahuasca and peyote and like these different drugs locally. But where was this interest prior to that? Like it feels like there's this ongoing like cycle or use of colonization to reclaim things that don't belong to certain cultures. And now we want to validate its use. And that's why we're interested now, when I think we should be integrating more with those communities, listening to what they have to say, working with them, trying to find fair ways of preserving different drugs or different plants that they come from. And then trying to tie that back into how we can change the laws that have been so fundamentally flawed since their inception.
I got to jump in with a really fucked up story. And that fucked up story is that in Chicago, it's very much a sports city, and the hockey team is called the Blackhawks. And one of the most loved players of the Blackhawks suffered traumatic brain injuries multiple times, and found that psilocybin was immensely helpful in helping him to navigate that and to do the kinds of things that he wanted to be able to do, and was able to do before multiple TBIs. And because the city council loves the Blackhawks, thinking about the name of the Blackhawks and the appropriation of Native American and First Nations imagery and naming devices, they passed a resolution unanimously to order the police department to stop arresting people for psilocybin possession. Fascinating, messed up story. But I'm also thinking about how American drug policy, in America, the drug war is a race war, in my view, and Chomsky has said it, many people have said it, we talk about it a lot, but every single drug law basically has been constructed to control a community of color, to control a particular racial or ethnic group. And I know, Ingrid, you've written a lot about that and thought about that a lot, but I wonder if you have anything you'd like to add on that in terms of like the way that drug law actually controls very specific groups and populations and their cultural expressions, going back to this idea of the intersection of culture and pleasure.
Yeah, I have to admit, it's hard to follow Yarlik's. I think she kind of covered it, but one of the things, which is why I'm thrilled that she went, one of the things I would add is that I think the even current drug law, the way that we are, for example, in the United States, in certain places legalizing the use of psychedelics is around issues of therapy, which is around, and MAPS has done great work and I don't want to completely denigrate this effort, but I'm deeply concerned that these plant medicines that have been used for millennia elsewhere for a variety of purposes in certain kinds of cultural contexts, United States, are now being appropriated by the mental health community as a solution to a problem in a very narrow space where only certain people can administer them, and it's very expensive to get trained to do that thing, and then it's very expensive to get the therapy, and so I think that's an example, even as we're creating drug laws now in this moment, in the ways in which we simply just disallow access and really lift drugs out of a cultural context that, should we understand it more holistically, might better serve those people who are seeking those seeking that healing.
Someone had a question in the chat around ethical cocaine supply. Is that possible? And there has been quite a lot of work done in the South around this, and especially under Morales in Bolivia. They were really looking for fair trade cocaine to countries, and they legalized it and started regulating it in Bolivia. And I thought they were actually selling shipments of regulated cocaine to somewhere in Europe. I don't know if that's even true. I probably shouldn't have said it without any backup, but these are ideas that are not new, and people have been kind of fighting for this from the South. Now Morales has been ousted. I'm sure that entire idea has gone out the window. But there are groups in Colombia who've been fighting for this as well. And so they need our support from the North to start sort of pushing those envelopes down in the South as well. So thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, let's we're not in a vacuum.
So we had a question in the chat. Sorry, I'm toggling back and forth between apps here. It's taking us away from the current topic and going back to pleasure and the use of substances among folks who are not experiencing acute problems, who are not experiencing substance use disorder or addiction. And I think this was from Nigel Brunston, thinking that when we talk about harm reduction approaches to use, people who are not experiencing substance use disorder talk about harm reduction and the importance of it, may opt out of that discussion because they don't think it applies to them. And I wonder if that's like something that sort of is potentially a resource for us in terms of movement building. I don't know if that makes sense.
Are you saying they're opting out of discussion because they don't feel like they're part of it?
I don't know. This is a question. I'm just gonna copy and paste it into chat.
Oh,
So
I'm not sure why that question just came up.
Yeah, I actually cannot put anything in chat myself. There we go.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I think I understand some of this. This is kind of like, I hear this a lot in like nightlife communities or people who use like on the weekends or things like that, where like they don't view themselves as people who have problematic substance use. So they distance themselves like, oh yeah, I'm not those people. I don't use every day or like whatever. So I'm not at risk in the same way that they are. And therefore, I don't need that messaging because I don't have a problem. Which is risky, especially now in the context of we don't know what's in the drugs. We don't know how strong they are. In the US, even drug checking programs that have the ability to check like drugs and send them to a lab, we don't have the ability to know how potent they are. And so even if we know, like I recently saw this article that said that there was an MDMA pill that had 430 kilograms of ecstasy or MDMA in that one pill, I was like, even if I took that and I checked it first, I would know it's MDMA, but I would still die if I took it because I had no idea what's in it. And so I think it's important to, you know, across, as we're speaking about pleasure in different spaces, also to folks that don't think that this applies to them, like reminding them about how we're all doing the same thing.
Yeah, and I wonder, yeah, Alex, what you think about like this advanced technology, drug checking, of which we're part. And it has, in my experience, become one of the greatest selling points for people who've always thought harm reduction wasn't necessary for them. They had the privilege and they weren't addicted and they weren't, you know, using street drugs or hard drugs or what have you, but they're flocking to drug checking services. And it's really interesting to see that being the hook for people who've historically thought themselves to be, you know, unfazed or unaffected by, or you know, really not in need of harm reduction services.
Yeah, when we do drug checking at festivals, there's a 2-hour lineup for drug checking. So people are standing in the hot 45-degree sun waiting to get their drugs checked. And I think this is a good time to bring up polysubstance use, because I think when we talk about festival and club and party, I mean, everybody uses multiple substances pretty well. The days are gone when it's like, this is my one DOC, right? Like one drug of choice and that's it. I don't do anything else. And I feel like as time, the last few years, I started like asking people like, so what does a typical night look like for you when you're using, because we have a sign outside our tent that says don't mix drugs, or don't mix drugs and alcohol because your overdose risks are higher. And then when I talk to everybody, and in my own experience, I'm like, when I think about a light, you start with cocaine and then you move into like a psychedelic for a little bit longer, but you add some MDMA to that. And later on you do some more cocaine and you have a few drinks, and then you do some nitrous and ketamine, and then maybe a bit of DMT later on, and then some GHB to sort of round out the night at the end. And it's like, when you think about the amount of polysubstance use that happens, but yet the messaging around it is just like, mixing is bad, you're going to die. And it's like, not the case. Actually, it's beneficial in a lot of ways, because I'm going to use way less cocaine if I add a psychedelic to my sort of mix for the night. And so really, it's actually a harm reduction and benefit maximization when it comes to polysubstance use. And some substances do not play well with others and can be really dangerous. But there's many that aren't. And so it's really about the knowledge and really being able to find that knowledge around drugs and be able to talk about it openly with each other. And I think one of the reasons why I thought drug checking was a good idea in the first place was because it allowed us to have conversations about drugs without there being an agenda, without there being some kind of judgment or stigma associated with that conversation. It's just, let's get that baggie out on the table and let's talk about what's in there, and let's talk about how we can get it into our bodies in a way that we're going to have a really good time and not die. Awesome.
Yeah, I love that, Chloe. And I love that you posed that question initially. That was your first response to being asked to join us in this panel. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that is it's just like our go-to, our default is mixing is bad, don't mix. And that just, it's so ridiculous, because almost all of us are mixing. And there's great value to that. And there are ways that mixing can be harm reduction. And I don't want to say more than that, but I just, that and you've also called attention to another major blind spot, or just kind of like an unthinking automated response we have, and that's around consent, sex, and drugs. Two critical areas that we just haven't done a good job of really talking about. I want to Dr. Cubillos, Paula Cubillos asked a question about cannabis, differential effects by gender, and the importance, or what we think about the need for differential messaging based on gender. maybe that's a few parting comments if we have any. If I don't know if Maddie can put that question up on the screen. We may not have time to address it. So I would just guess, I would just say, you know, what do we think about differential messaging and harm reduction by gender?
It's a very good question, because I feel like when I talk to women about cannabis use, for myself, cannabis makes me feel completely stupid and actually really self-conscious, and I have like go into a corner and start rocking. But I don't find men have the same issue. So, and I talk to a lot of women like that. So I'm interested to hear that people talk about that, because I only know from my own personal experience around that.
I know something that I talk about a lot in like the psychedelic space is the importance of building relationships with the substances that you use, because we all have particular body chemistries. We all have different ways of using drugs or dosing drugs, or particular drugs that our bodies just vibe with, right? So like I have friends that smoke every day and they love it, and that's what works best for them. Whereas other people, they take a puff and they have a panic attack, you know, and that's just a response that the body has. And so I think for me, something that's helpful is getting to know what works for me and how it works. I think something that I hope that there's more research on integrating like how particular drugs work in the body and why, and maybe in that way there can be messaging that is not just about like, don't do this thing because it's harmful, but like, hey, women, you know, maybe when you're on your period, like be careful with how much you're consuming as opposed to other parts of your cycle, because it can lead to differential effects or something like that. But also integrating pleasure in some way, because that's really an important message. Like it's why a lot of folks are using drugs in the first place. So that's kind of what came to mind for me.
Setting and dose, right?
I think also more than just the individual interaction with the drug, like the pharmacokinetic stuff, it's about environments, isn't it? And like how you can have very different effects of the same drug in different environments. So I guess it's learning about, that whole complex of things that's going on. Somebody.
And if you think about how most of us have learned those things, and we've learned it through experience, right? In these user communities, and friend groups. And wouldn't it be nice if that wasn't the only way to find that out? That if you were new and you didn't have friends who did this drug, that you had ways of understanding and benefiting from that user-based knowledge, and understanding issues of context, setting, and dose, but also understanding, where safer supply is, and all of those issues, which for me really takes it back to this issue of the discourses of harm reduction and health and medicalization and criminalization have sort of disallowed for a space where we can just say, hey, I really want to try that thing, or I love that thing, and but I can't find it anymore, and where can I find it? And not having to have this be, sort of underground networks.
I think one of the things about being an older drug user is you have those experiences early on to draw from to have a better experience. So, and when I was younger, I didn't have people to go ask these questions to, right? And I feel like if we have the people to ask, like, hey, how can I make this a good experience? And they can actually tell us that, then it would forgo a lot of traumatic drug experiences.
Yeah, there's a lot of that sort of stuff happening online, isn't there? I think there's a lot of unofficial kind of harm reduction stuff going on the dark net.
Right, and we've come back to the point of consideration, which is prohibition creating silences that do a tremendous amount of damage, right? It's not just the overt practice of drug control and interdiction, but it's also about the silences doing great damage. And with that, I think we have to end. I'm sad to say. Thank you all so much. You are amazing humans, and I'm deeply inspired by you. And thanks to the organizers and especially to the audience for engaging so actively in this conversation with us. I don't actually know what to do now. I think I have to hit the leave button.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and everybody.
Thanks all.
All right. Thank you all.